So I think Chris Nolan's The Odyssey actually presents a problem for the IMAX brand potentially going forward. Now, you might think I'm crazy, and that could be true, but I do think even though The Odyssey has sold out multiple IMAX screenings, is a massive success, and everyone is talking about the fact that it is the first film to be shot entirely in 70mm IMAX, there is an issue that the very nature of that film and the very nature of the fact that it is shot in that way actually presents a challenge to the IMAX Corporation and what they do going forward. So this is a little bit of a hot take, but I'd like to see if you can kind of come aboard with my opinion, and if not, then I'm happy to discuss in the comments and see what you think. This also is going to be my last IMAX video for a little while. I think it's time to change topic. So I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe, because I've got loads of great ideas for videos, and in order for you to find out about them, it really helps the channel visibility if we build our subscriber count a little bit more. Anyway, so why am I being as crazy enough to suggest the massive IMAX success of The Odyssey is an potential problem for IMAX? Well, strap in, this is going to get nerdy. So what is IMAX? Well, it's a large format film system designed to project on giant screens. It uses 70mm film stock that runs horizontally through the camera and projector, allowing incredibly high image quality. The reason why IMAX image quality is so good is because with motion picture film, the physical size of the film matters. Like, the bigger you make the film, the higher the quality of the image. So basically, the resolution increases as you boost the size of the film stock. And IMAX film stock is about 10 times the size of conventional 35mm film stock used for like the majority of cinema. So that means you have an image that is potentially almost 10 times the quality in terms of resolution and grain levels. So it's a very high res image on screen. If you were to compare IMAX film to digital, and most cinemas project digital in resolutions of between 2K and 4K, IMAX is sort of equated to 12 to 15K, something like that. I mean, it depends on the film stock, but IMAX is still much higher quality than most conventional digital projection. And even though IMAX as a format was launched in the 1970s, it's still one of the gold standards of image quality today. That's the reason why people get excited about Chris Nolan shooting an IMAX, because it's potentially the best quality film image that you could go and see. The downside of IMAX 70mm is the difficulty and expense. So shooting an IMAX is difficult, and I've made a video on the topic that is linked in the comments, so do please give that a watch if you want to learn about the IMAX filmmaking process or just how hard it is. But also, it's difficult from the theatre side as well, in that IMAX installations are expensive. The individual film prints cost tens of thousands of dollars each, so they're very expensive to run, and also like the staffing costs are higher than conventional cinemas. So IMAX, for the first 30 years of its existence, struggled to expand, and it was due to the cost of like those IMAX installations were expensive and expensive to run, so they would only work in certain markets, and there was a limited number of places that IMAX theatres could be built and be successful. So around the late 90s, early noughties, there were about 100 IMAX screens worldwide. It was not a big number, and the reason was really to do with costs, that there was like a ceiling to how many 70mm theatres could be built. Less about the technology, more about the financial situation of whether it was workable or not. So, and the limitation of having only 100 IMAX screens at sort of the late 90s, early noughties is still an issue today, in that that's what's limiting the number of screens that can screen the Odyssey in film today. So there is a sort of link between IMAX past and how hard it was for them to build 70mm sites and how to expand, and also that's why so many people are frustrated about not being able to get tickets to see the IMAX 70mm version of the Odyssey, because that number of sites has not expanded, and it's not expanded for these reasons. So if IMAX were going to expand beyond the limited number of 70mm screens, they needed to embrace new technology, and they did. They moved to digital projection. And that made sense in the sense that digital projection is cheaper to run. It would definitely reduce the running costs compared to IMAX and offer flexibility that the 70mm format doesn't offer. The issue is, at the time of IMAX creating their digital format, the state of the art in digital projection was the 2K Texas Instruments DLP chip. And that was what was being installed in conventional cinemas, and also what IMAX chose to base their projectors on. Now, the main problem, well, there's a few problems with this. The first one is that 2K digital is a long way removed from 70mm film. So the quality is just not even close as good. Also, the chip on the DLP projector has an aspect ratio of 1.9 to 1, which is not compatible with the 1.43 format of traditional IMAX. And then finally, if other cinema projectors are based around similar 2K digital, then IMAX doesn't necessarily have a huge quality advantage over them. Like going to see a film on a digital IMAX wouldn't be vastly better than seeing it in a conventional auditorium because they're kind of based on the same technology. That said, the change to digital was a big success, and IMAX expanded exponentially, so 1,000% and more. And partially I think this is because IMAX had good brand recognition, and people that loved IMAX or had seen the film format were excited to see films in quote-unquote IMAX theatres, even if they're sort of technically compromised in the digital format. But there was still, IMAX digital theatres were still better than conventional theatres in that they had better sound, the projection was usually better calibrated, they used 2 projectors for extra brightness and better 3D. So there was an advantage to digital IMAX, but it doesn't come close in terms of quality to film IMAX. IMAX in 2014 did develop a 4K laser projection, which was much, much better than their 2K digital projection, but I think most people would say that the 70mm format is still the gold standard and still better. But that said, its digital has allowed IMAX to expand, and it made sense for them to go in that direction because there was like a glass ceiling with 70mm. They could only build so many. The costs were so high that if they wanted to be a bigger, more mainstream organization, they would have to embrace digital. And yes, the quality would be a bit less than 70mm, but it would still be better than average. So, people would enjoy it. And that's what they did. So IMAX embraced digital kind of wholeheartedly, to be honest. And around the time of starting the first digital installations, they stopped manufacturing the film projectors because, they saw that the future was digital. And that sort of has made sense within cinema in that, in most cinemas, film formats have been phased out and digital, for better for worse, is the future. And IMAX, from that period, seemed to have its eyes focused on a digital future. Okay, so what has this got to do with Chris Nolan? Well, I'll get to that. Around the time of digital happening in IMAX, Chris Nolan started filming in 70mm film IMAX. So the first film was The Dark Knight in 2008, and he's consistently filmed on 70mm film IMAX on every production since then, and culminating with The Odyssey, the first film to be shot entirely in 70mm IMAX. And as we know, that's been a huge success, but why is that a problem? Well, it leaves IMAX in this weird position because they were moving to digital and they had sort of wound down elements of their film operation, and film as a technology, sadly, there isn't an infinite future in film. Like they were probably right to move to digital because ultimately film is not going to be a mainstream format in the future. But the problem with Chris Nolan's IMAX films and a few others is how successful they are. They've been massively successful, particularly Odyssey, and people have been clamoring to see it in 70mm IMAX. And, we're excited about seeing in that format, and that is the gold standard thing, which now means that IMAX is in the uncomfortable position of being in competition with itself, in that digital IMAX theatres are in competition with film IMAX theatres, and because we know that IMAX is technically better, and it's reminding audiences that the digital one is inferior, because most people, when they're talking about, oh, the way Nolan intended is you must see it in film, you must see it in the film, you must see it in film, which reminds people that, oh, those IMAX digitals are inferior. Avoid those, see it in film. And they have the other frustration that, well, you can't see it in film, not easily. There's only 41 screens. So they're creating this interesting dichotomy that the films made by Nolan kind of negatively show up the digital experience, or potentially do. They show that it's limited, and then there's a frustration around how many film locations there are, and that at this point can't be expanded. So people talk about, we need to build more film IMAXs, they need to build more projectors. Well, I mean, I think 25 years after building the last projector, that's not really practical. And even if they could do it, it would be incredibly expensive, and there's not enough films being shot in 70mm to make it worthwhile. So Chris Nolan making an IMAX film every 5 years is not enough to justify expanding the fleet of IMAX projectors. But we have this problem that IMAX were all in on digital. Now they're sort of, we're digital with film, which are we? And I feel like actually the film promotion and success has been a bit of a distraction for them, that because they haven't really developed their digital side since 2014. So in 2014 they released the 4K laser system, and it's very, very good, but it's not as good as IMAX 70mm. They haven't improved it, they haven't expanded on it, and technology's marched on. If you look now at systems using LED technology, the Las Vegas Sphere, which uses a giant LED screen, is vastly superior to digital IMAX projection. It's better contrast, it's higher resolution, and probably the future of digital cinema is likely to be around screen technology rather than projection technology. And IMAX have sort of lost the march on that technology, in that they were the gold standard when it came to film, but on digital they no longer are. There's better technologies, and they're not pushing to be the best anymore. And I feel like it's kind of because they're distracted by film, and film potentially is a dead end, because yes, they may be able to release a few more 70mm films, but at the end, like, loads of filmmakers aren't going to work in 70mm, and ultimately the format is limited to the 31 screens they already have, and people will always be frustrated about not being able to see stuff in 70mm because most screens are digital, and people will see the digital screens as flawed unless they do something to improve them. Like, why aren't IMAX digital screens in 8K, 10K, 12K? Why aren't they embracing either multi-projector technology, stitching, or LED screens? Because they could, and they could do something similar to the Las Vegas Sphere and make an ultra-high resolution digital screen that would be a worthy successor of the 70mm format that was so good. But they haven't, and it feels like at the moment they're still between the two things. Anyway, that's my thoughts. I'd love to hear your comments on this. Thanks again. Please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Cheers.